Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started because we only have an hour to work with, so we do want to maximize our time. So thank you for joining us. My name is Danielle Colangelo, and I'm the coordinator of literacy here at Putnam Northern Westchester BOCES. And we welcome everyone to today's Fireside Chat with Learning Ovations. As partners to PNW BOCES, Learning Ovations is going to facilitate the conversation this afternoon as we have worked together in the past with a presentation in the fall of 2019 with Amanda Jacobs. Amanda, do you want to say hello there?
Hello, everybody. Wonderful to see everybody's faces. Thanks for taking the time to connect. As you're listening today, and if you have any further questions or wonderings, definitely feel free. Our contact information is at the end. A lot of learning. Glad to see your face.
Thanks, Amanda. Amanda and I have been chatting throughout this year, and we realized we could partner together for another opportunity regarding a hot topic in schools, the science of reading. So, our topic today is how to bridge the science of reading with your existing curriculum. We want to spend some time unpacking the buzz around the science of reading to provide opportunities for leaders to reflect on research based practice in literacy, to process new information with an expert from the field, and to ask questions to a leader familiar with the work it takes in bridging former practice with new practice, while keeping the end goal in mind of all children reading by third grade. We have three big questions that we're going to tackle in our chat today. What is the science of reading and why is it important to understand? If my curriculum doesn't include the science of reading, what can I do? And how can teachers practice the science of reading and who is doing this kind of work? So with these questions in mind, let's meet our speakers who will lead our conversation and learning for today. So we're excited to have with us Dr. Sarah Siegel of Learning Ovations and Superintendent Dr. Mark Biacco of Elmsford Union Free School District. Learning Ovations is partnered with the U.S. Department of Education and has been bridging the gap between the science of reading and practice for the last 13 years, working alongside various school districts across the country. Their Vice President for Research and Practice is Dr. Sarah Siegel, whose research has focused on the development of reading, writing, and spelling skills in elementary and middle school students, as well as educational technology, writing instruction, classroom observation, and writing assessment development. Dr. Siegel, or as she prefers to be referred to, Sarah, will be leading our conversation today regarding the science of reading and how to bridge the science of reading using your existing curriculum. Following Sarah, we'll hear from Dr. Mark Biacco, who has served the community in Elmsford as superintendent for the past 10 years. From the time students begin their academic journey at Dixon Primary School till their graduation from Alexander Hamilton High School, it is the shared mission to optimize teaching and learning for student achievement by providing the highest quality educational experience possible. Dr. Biocco shares that the teachers and students have made great strides in improving teaching and learning throughout their Elmsford Union Free School District, and most recently through applying the science of reading. So without further ado, I welcome Sarah to kick off our afternoon.
Awesome, thank you. Hello, everyone. Great to be here. So as Danielle explained, we are going to get started and really start with a conversation about the science of reading and then get into how this really looks in practice in the classroom. And so my goal is to be as informative as possible today, but also entertaining. So hopefully at the end, you can let me know how I do. But to kick us off, I kind of wanted to pull out three main topics that we're going to hit today. So first, the science of reading, which we're going to call the old, and I'll explain in a little bit. Second, the four types of reading instruction, which we're going to consider the new. And then luckily for us today, we don't have the ugly, we have the effective. And so we're going to talk about what this actually looks like in Elmsford, New York in practice. So to kick things off, we definitely need to start with this conversation and buzz around the science of reading. And if you've attended anything relating to the science of reading, read anything you've been sent recently, there are kind of three main pieces of information that are forming the base of this sort of science of reading conversation. And so I want to kind of lay that foundation for our conversation today so we're all on the same page. And so the first two pieces that may look familiar to you if you've been starting to engage in these science of reading kind of conversations are the simple view of reading and the 5 pillars of reading from the National Reading Panel. So first off, just looking at the simple view of reading, you can see that it really is an equation. And so the combination of word recognition and language comprehension lead to reading comprehension. And so this product is kind of a way to understand that there are two kind of simplified components that when multiplied together lead to this goal of reading comprehension. But you can see how if you had more of one skill or more of the other, you would still get to reading comprehension to a certain degree. However, if you have zero in one of those categories, you're also not going to have reading comprehension at all. So this is a really kind of nice, neat way to start thinking about how students develop these comprehension skills. And it also allows us to think about these skills on a quadrant system. So you could have students who have really high word recognition and high language comprehension. They're doing great. They have both these skills, but you could also have a student who is perhaps an English language learner who is decoding perfectly, but has no idea what they're actually reading. And so thinking about things from kind of this quadrant perspective is really helpful in understanding reading development. However, as you can see on this slide, this was first published in 1986. And so this is not something that has been super new on the research side of things, but it's just starting to be part of the conversation we're hearing now in the science of reading publications. The second one, as you can see, is those 5 pillars that came out in 2000. And this is just the idea that reading is actually a little more complex than this simple view and has 5 key components that are phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And so you'll start to see some common themes develop as we talk today, that there's a lot of ways to really tell this story about reading development, but there starts to be a lot of commonalities between these different ideas as well. And so the third one I want to touch on is kind of forming this base of understanding is Scarborough's rope. And this was from 2002. And it really is a combination of essentially those 5 pillars and the simple view of reading. So here you see kind of another way to understand how reading develops, this final result being the ability to have skilled reading, fluent execution, and understanding. But it still comes from 2 main pieces, just like the simple view, language comprehension and word recognition. And just like the 5 pillars now, we're starting to pull out these separate pieces. We're understanding that automaticity is coming into play. There's a strategic component. But at the end of the day, it's a combination of these factors, again, that lead to reading. And then I want to point out, again, just that this is from 2002. So a lot of this work was being done and starting to form the foundation for the next steps in research. But there definitely is a gap forming between how this research is then being brought into the classroom. And so the first thing that I want to touch on for this conversation is acknowledging that research to practice gap. So there's researchers on one side, they're doing their thing, they're developing these models to understand reading better, but there's no bridge between the communication for teachers in the classroom, administrators, or even district leaders, superintendents. And this creates a lot of confusion in the middle because it's really hard to access information that you don't even know exists. And so this is just the reality of the situation up until recently when this conversation started. And one of the reasons I'm actually part of Learning Ovations now and didn't continue in academia is because of this gap. It is extremely frustrating. And so there are a million reasons it is formed. And so I won't read through all the bullets for you. But one example that I think really paints this picture is just the fact that to be a research professor, one of your key job performance metrics is publishing peer-reviewed journal articles. So you're doing a bunch of research, you're publishing it in a journal, you're using a lot of that expert jargon, high-level statistics, and you're doing great in your field. However, administrators are the people who could really use that information. Not only might not be able to understand it because you're writing it for your peers, or it might have really complex, not super practical methods, but it's behind a paywall. So even if you're willing to kind of slog through that research article, it's really hard to access it. And so this is one of the things that really made me think, how can we start bridging the gap between research and practice and not have it be research versus practice? And that's another reason why, as we're talking about some of the concepts today, if they don't sound familiar or they do seem like an older concept, the reason that that is sounding like new information is because there is this gap. And so that's something that hopefully going forward, everyone will be able to work towards addressing. So with that in mind, what else do we know about language development or reading that would be helpful to kind of think about how our classroom should look? So this is the kind of other side, in addition to the reading research I showed you, what about language, right? We have that decoding piece, but we also need to think about vocabulary and language. And I am a developmental psychologist by training. So to me, everything is development. And so this really helps me understand as well how all of these pieces fit together, not just for literacy skills, but for a student overall. So this timeline is from a developmental perspective, but more over the course of evolution. And so you can see that spoken language emerged way, way, way back in the day. You can see why evolutionarily being able to communicate with another human would benefit your survival. And spoken language existed for a long, long time before written language emerged. And even then, if we think back to when written language or needing to read was something that the general public had access to, it really wasn't even until after the printing press was invented, so 1439. So there's a huge difference in how our brains have evolved to understand spoken language and vocabulary versus how we understand and use written text. And so this is really important to remember as we're thinking about how you learn to hear language and how you learn to read. The other way to kind of think about this is on a much, much shorter scale, just on an individual infant's development. And so this graph that you see here is actually the percentage of correct times an infant can identify two different sounds in a language they're not very familiar with. So the blue bar is sounds that are played for the infant in Hindi. The green bar are sounds that are played for the infant in that language that is written on the slide in green. I'm not going to try to pronounce it for you, but there are two languages that in the English speaking households, these infants are not hearing every day. And so a example that would be relevant for us in English is they hear the word pa or the sound pa played over and over again. All of a sudden it switches to the phoneme ba, and the infant would look up, right? I was hearing pa, ba is a different sound. I'm a little surprised. But there are certain sounds that are only in some languages. And so those sounds were played for the infants when they were between 6 and 8 months of age. And you can see that on this left bar. And they still were able to tell the difference almost 100% of the time. So even though they didn't speak Hindi, they weren't hearing it day to day, they could distinguish between those two different sounds. All it took was about 6 more months or until they were 12 months old, where their ability to hear sounds they weren't familiar with or weren't hearing in their day-to-day life in their English-speaking homes down to about 20%. So this language development that's happening naturally is also happening really rapidly. And so this is another way to kind of think about the difference between learning to read versus learning to speak. So let's bring everything kind of all together now and think about how both development and these kind of models for learning to read all fit together for a student. So here's a chart that really helps me. On the x-axis, we just have time because it's development, right? So everything is passing. We're starting at birth and we're getting up through 3rd grade and then into middle school for literacy ability. And that is what we're going to think of as on this y-axis. So if we look from about birth till students enter school, their vocabulary or that language ability we just talked about, we now know is going to be growing continuously. You're hearing language, you're being exposed to vocabulary, and you're being asked to do certain things by your parents, so you understand what that means. And so all of those skills are growing day to day. However, decoding, or the ability to really crack the code of understanding that symbols represent sounds that make up language, doesn't really start to grow until you're explicitly taught it, which for most kiddos would be either pre-K or kindergarten. And so you can see this line is relatively flat till we hit this marker where we're now learning to read. And I like to think of these two lines as really converging at about 3rd grade in an ideal setting, where we're helping students have their decoding catch up to the language they can access via oral vocabulary, via spoken conversation, or auditory books. And so you can see there's kind of a progression in how these decoding skills, like learning phonemic awareness, then matching sounds and letters to corresponding symbols, and then starting to be able to recognize how those letters and sounds actually represent words that have meaning more automatically. And so as each of those skills progresses, we're really just catching up that decoding ability to the student's vocabulary. And then one more other really relevant and interesting piece of research that aligns to this fact is that we can recognize all of those pieces I just touched on now using neural imaging. And so we know there's not kind of a central magical reading portion of the brain what we're actually doing when we're connecting vocabulary and decoding is starting to connect the portions of the brain that do all these things and make that connection more and more streamlined. And that's why practice and that automaticity piece is so important, is we're building those pathways in the brain. And that's exactly what we've seen in neuroscience. But not only have we seen that on neuroimaging, the neuroscience research has also revealed that actually about 95% of students have the cognitive capacity to learn to read at grade level. And you can see from these breakdowns that that looks different for specific students though. So depending on which chart you look at, these numbers shift slightly, but the general story is about the same. And what it's telling us is that about 30% of students will learn to read sort of regardless of environment. Just exposure to text and a little support will get them there. And about 50% of students can learn to read with high quality tier 1 instruction. And that's going to be what we're going to talk about in a second, is what do we need so that we're making sure that those students are getting that high quality tier 1 instruction. And then finally, there's about 15% of students who might need a little more time. They might need a little support to get there, but they can get to that on-level reading ability. And then finally, there's only about 5% of students who have a severe cognitive impairment that would prevent them from getting to that on-grade level reading. And so if we're knowing different students are going to need different things in their instruction to get them to reading at grade level, how do we figure out what that is? And how can we get this kind of percentage chart to be more commonly represented in how our test scores look? Because we know in a lot of districts and nationally, this is not what it looks like currently. Well, I have a few answers and a few things we know don't work to kind of start that conversation off. So first, we know that that list on the left are things that on their own will not get us there, right? If there was a single textbook or a single diagnostic tool that guaranteed students would be reading at grade level, it would already be everywhere, right? If there was one single answer that solved all these problems or a silver bullet solution, we would know about it. So it's these things in combination, just like how your brain is kind of forming these connections, it's connecting and aligning the overarching literacy framework that's really going to make a difference. And so these 6 kind of key takeaways are some of the areas where we can start doing that. So first, the science of reading, while it's super important, and all of this information I hope is giving you some takeaways, on its own, it's not going to change reading outcomes. In the same way, standards are not enough to move literacy outcomes on their own. What is really important is the cognitive research shows, and that neuroscience kind of percentage graph, that really it's high quality instructional materials that also meet individual student needs that will make a difference. That the same thing isn't needed and isn't going to work for every student. We also know that assessments are not sufficient in and of themselves. If you know a student is struggling in an area, you also need to know how to address that struggle. So knowing how to teach it is critical. And then teachers need the right knowledge, skills, and tools to then have that how. And then finally, just as we kind of started talking about at the beginning, these different areas of reading research, we have to really start to move beyond just thinking about, okay, we're checking off the 5 types of reading instruction and start thinking about how we're integrating them together, because that's how our brain is going to learn how to read. And that's how we'll really be able to connect that decoding and vocabulary portion of our knowledge into actual comprehension. All right, so that was a ton of information, very fast. I'm going to take a little pause here. If you have questions, feel free to shoot them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask now. And then after we've taken a little break for that, I'm going to move on to the next topic. Good to move on. All right, well, as I go, do feel free to shoot something into the chat too, and I'm happy to pause, or when we kind of get to the end, there's a chance to ask some questions too. So please feel free to interject. So now that we have kind of this base level understanding about what reading research looks like, what kind of the full landscape there is, how can we start thinking about these 4 types of reading instruction that I mentioned that need to be integrated to actually help teachers apply the right types of reading instruction for the right students in their actual classrooms? And so this is what we're going to call the new. And this is also my kind of main area of expertise, because my mentor in grad school was the main one carrying out this work. And so this is kind of an overview of Dr. Carol Croner's research, and it really focuses in on something that she was able to identify called child by instruction interactions, or the idea that different students need different things to be successful. And this may sound really obvious. Most teachers who have been in the classroom know this. However, researchers in the early 2000s were having a really hard time actually finding this on their assessment scores and in their studies. And so Carol was able to kind of take a step back and say, my teacher is saying, hey, I teach the same thing and one student gets it and one doesn't. Why is that? But it just wasn't showing up. The simple view of reading should work for everyone. And that just wasn't ending up actually being the case in reality. And what she discovered were two really important things. First of all, students came into the classroom with very, very different learning profiles, and those predicted how they benefited or didn't benefit from certain instructional moves the teacher made. So if you're ready to learn something, it would benefit you. If you spent a bunch of time on something you weren't ready for, it's not going to help promote your growth in that area. But the other really important part of this was even students who are in the same classroom actually experience different amounts and types of instruction. So if you start a whole group lesson and every time you get to the flashcard portion, maybe Amanda decides that's a really good time to kind of turn around and start playing with a rubber band, and it's just not her favorite lesson. Even though everyone is in that lesson for 30 minutes, Amanda's getting maybe about 5 to 10 minutes of that instruction, whereas a student who's really engaged, who's interested in learning that, is getting over 30. And so just because a teacher is focused on a lesson doesn't necessarily mean all students are getting that instruction. And so this helped kind of move the bar in thinking how we can better think about what's actually happening in a classroom. And so this is what allows us to then start categorizing things, right? How do we really want to think about the literacy block? So on the left here are two terms that look new, but are actually the same things we've been talking about from the beginning. The first is code focused skills. And this is essentially, from the simple view of reading, that word recognition part of the equation. So these are any instructional moves or lessons that focus on letter knowledge, phonemic awareness, phonics, spelling, fluency, really anything that helps students start cracking that code. But then there is a second half, which is, again, now we're thinking about either language comprehension or vocabulary, these meaning focused skills or lessons that focus on vocabulary, comprehension, writing, understanding the meaning behind language. And all instruction that was observed in real classrooms in Carol's studies could be categorized into one of these two areas. But the other big thing she noticed was that they can be delivered in two different ways, either through teacher managed activities where the teacher is guiding the student's instruction, the teacher is responsible for their focus, or child managed activities, which could be individual student work or students working in peer groups. And as it turns out, one of the things that really allowed her to discover those child by instruction interactions, we're seeing how students who got different amounts and types in these four areas either really kind of took off and had a lot of growth over the school year, or if they didn't get the right ratio of these activities, they didn't make the growth we'd expect to see. So it was a really clear way to start identifying what students actually needed to spend their time on during the literacy block. So what does that actually look like? Here is an example from a first grade classroom. And as you guys are probably well familiar, students come into that classroom in the fall with a bunch of different skill sets. And so on the left-hand side, you can see we have a bunch of reading levels listed. So this is a first grade classroom, but you could have a student coming in at a kindergarten level, at a first grade level, at a second or even a third grade level, all entering your classroom in the fall of first grade. But this means that those students need different amounts and types of those four reading instruction areas. And so that means that that student reading at a kindergarten level actually needs, if we focus in on this blue, about 30 minutes of instruction from the teacher that is code focused time. However, their peer who's reading right at grade level in the fall only needs about 10 minutes. So there's really a drastic difference in what's going to benefit the students most, depending on where they spend their time and how that instruction is carried out. The other big thing that's not represented here, but is really, really important finding from Carol's work, is that small group code focused instruction, so teacher managed code focused instruction, this blue again, that is done in a small group environment is 4 to 10 times more effective. So if a student needs 10 minutes, but it's done in a small group session, you're almost getting 4 times more bang for that 10-minute session than you would in an hour-long whole group lesson. So we really want to focus on meeting a student's needs, but also making the most of the most valuable resource in the classroom, which is teacher time. And so we want to start taking the guesswork out of how to really differentiate for teachers and for students by providing these recommendations. And that was Carol's real goal, is if we now know what works for students, how can we help teachers just have this information at their fingertips? And if you haven't caught on yet already, this algorithm kind of producing recommendation system is pretty complex. So thank goodness Carol also had the great foresight to ask technology to do a lot of this work for us. So she developed algorithms that actually produce, based on a student's skill profile, these recommendations individualized for every single student. So there's no calculation needed. There's a really, really short assessment process. And then the system that we call assessment to instruction, or A2I, is able to spit out these minute recommendations for every single student. And the real focus of this goal was to then, again, knowing how to spend instructional time exactly where students need it. So that is what now makes up what we call the A2I professional support system. And so this was originally done as work in what is called ISI, or individualizing student instruction intervention. But once all these technological pieces got put in place, we were able to move it all online. So there's really low lift for teachers getting this information and to really start focusing on how to apply it in the classroom. So what the system does is has a set of online assessments that map out a student's vocabulary, decoding, and comprehension skills. And you should be sick of hearing me say those 3 things by now, because those are really those key indicators we need to know what a student needs. Then second, the technology now produces those minute recommendations, just like you saw in the previous slide, where teachers and students need to spend their time, child managed or teacher managed, and code focused or meaning focused. And then third, and this is where that curriculum piece comes in. And definitely feel free to ask me additional questions about this, but I want to just kind of give a brief overview now, is we actually recommend within our system activities from curriculum or resources that you already have, what would fit into those recommendation categories. So if your student needs 30 minutes of teacher managed meaning focused time, we can tell you where to find that activity. And so that was a really key component too. We think of it as being curriculum agnostic. There's not one magical, again, silver bullet activity to kind of fit these needs. We know as long as you're falling within those recommended minutes, we're going to see results. And then finally, the other really, really critical piece of this system is the customized support. So teachers are supported every step of the way in not just understanding kind of the research background that I'm explaining you today, but also how to implement and differentiate in their classroom as the school year progresses. So if they're not familiar with using small groups, if they're nervous about teaching a certain one of those categories that I mentioned, like child managed time is sometimes a little bit stressful because you are letting students go off and work independently, we're going to support you in understanding not just what their minute recommendations say, but how to make those happen in your classroom. And then what this allows us to do is start, just like Scarborough's rope, start connecting all of these multiple pieces critical for reading into one kind of supportive system. And so we're able to connect core curriculum to additional supplements. Assessments are now talking to those materials. And we're also able to add in intervention strategies. So one of the things our system also does is always identify what a student needs, not restrict it based on scheduling or available time. And so if you see a few students who have time that exceeds the literacy block, that's a great indicator for us to say, hey, that might be a student who does need a little more time, needs some tier 2 instruction. How are we going to make sure they get those recommended minutes they need? So the last kind of overarching question and takeaway here is, this all sounds, a little complicated, but pretty great. Get what I need, get my lessons, I'm ready to go. Does it work? And this is the really important part to me as the person who helped kind of conduct these studies and participate in this research, is that yes, we have 7 randomized control trials over almost 13 years, as Amanda said. So just the randomized control trials took place from 2005 to 2011, but we've been doing this research for much, much longer. And results revealed consistently that if teachers had access to those A2I recommendations, their students did better. And not just better, we actually had a longitudinal study where we followed the same students from 1st to 2nd to 3rd grade. And for the students who were in A2I classrooms all 3 years, 94% of them are reading at or above grade level, and they actually had a 5th grade reading average. So we're seeing if students repeatedly get this benefit of the right amount and type of instruction, we're really, really seeing a difference in their reading outcomes. So I'm going to pause again, just make sure there are no other questions, and then we're going to get to hear not just from me and what this was like on the kind of research side of things, but also how this looks in a school district. But before I hand it over to Mark, any questions for me? All right. I think I will hand it over then. This is Mark Biacco, and he is the superintendent from one of our districts in Elmsford, New York.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm going to share with you, to the best of my ability, our journey and where we came from, what A2I has done for us, what the relationship with Learning Ovations has done for us, and more importantly, what it has done for our students. And looking at the outcomes, the instructional outcomes that we saw as a result of embarking on this journey. And it truly was that. It was a journey. I will say that the first step in this journey was the risk-taking. Oftentimes we become very tied to whatever reading program we're using. And it is very difficult oftentimes to cut those ties and be able to acknowledge, number one, that you have a problem. And then secondly, once you acknowledge having a problem, what is the right fix for that problem? And I think too often what we do is we try to find a program that's going to fix the problem. And what A2I does for us is it gives us not only the research-based piece that Sarah was talking so eloquently about, but it also gives us tangibles, things that we could put into the classroom that are flexible and that are responsive to student needs. And I'll take you a little through that as I talk a little bit about our journey. So I am 12 years in the Elmsford Union Free School District. I was 8 years as principal of the high school. And my last 4 years I spent in the role of superintendent of schools. And during that time, we had done an audit, a curriculum audit, where we were looking at what are some of the things that we needed to do to improve our reading results. Overall, we were not happy with our reading results. We knew that there was room for improvement there, but more importantly, what we were really concerned about was our subgroups. More specific, our students with special needs, in addition to which are English language learners. And those two areas for us became very, very instrumental in the decisions that we were about to make. The second thing to note is that we are a predominantly Latino district. We are about 60% Latino. So we have a number of English language learners, some of which are newcomers into our program. And it was important for us that we were not only reaching the enrichment levels, but that we were also looking at the language acquisition piece here. And that's where Learning Ovations became a key for us. And I'll get into that in a moment as well. So if we go back about 4 years ago now, we started to recognize that in acknowledging that we had this problem and needed to address these subgroups in particular, we started to look at what are some of our options out there. And like anyone else, we went through the traditional unpacking and auditing of different programs. And quite frankly, I found myself at PNW BOCES, where I had an opportunity to meet the staff and Jay Connor, the CEO and founder of Learning Ovations. And it became very intriguing to see what Learning Ovations was offering through its A2I initiative. And in that, I started to delve into the research, and I was looking at a lot of the studies that were done and some of the schools that were involved in these studies, and did these schools mirror our needs? And that was important to me. So in confirming that there were schools within the study that mirrored some of our students and some of our schools, I decided to look deeper into this. And as we started to examine the whole decoding process, it really reigned supreme with a lot of our teachers, because what our teachers were saying for a long time is we got to get back to teaching phonics, right? Phonics is just so important. And they're not wrong. But as we started to look at the research and what A2I did differently, is that phonics is one aspect of the reading continuum. The other aspect of this is decoding. And without decoding, even if we're teaching phonics, we can't be 100% effective. So as we started to acknowledge this, we started to realize more and more that we, as a collective whole within our school community, were unhappy with our curriculum. We were unhappy with the way we were going about teaching reading. So we partnered with Learning Ovations, and that's where the risk comes in, right? We were taking a new program and we were jumping right into this new program based on what we were seeing. So we were making an informed decision. It was a informed risk taking, if you will, calculating. So in doing so, our teachers started to come on board and they started to really unpack what A2I was about. We were then assigned a literacy coach that was coming to our school, and that, I got to say, is absolutely essential. It was such an integral part of getting the teachers in the direction in which they needed to go and thinking outside the box, because here is an independent outsider, yet a friend to our school, that was able to come in and do these coaching exercises and help our instructional staff look at things a little bit differently. The way I equate it is, sometimes you write a letter and the letter reads really well to you, right? But when you give it to somebody else and they read the letter, they're like, this sentence doesn't make sense, right? It's because you're processing it the way you wrote it, right? So to you, it makes perfect sense. So that's what was happening with our instructional program, is we were starting to look at things a lot differently, because to us it made sense, but we weren't getting the results that we wanted. So we needed that additional support and the additional voice in there to help our instructional staff look at things a little bit differently. The second thing we did was we partnered with an independent outside organization to come in and do a curriculum audit. And what we found in that curriculum audit is that our pedagogy was strong. It was solid. The teachers were doing a great job in the classroom, but everybody was all over the place. So we really lacked vertical and horizontal articulation, and that was in a K-12 audit. So as we started to examine, well, how do we bring the articulation level into play? Again, Learning Ovations and A2I, through its literacy coaching, through the huddles that we were doing with our staff, all started to bring those pieces together and build a more robust vertical and horizontal articulation process. The other thing we started to look at is, are we addressing the right students? In other words, do we have a way to assess students and provide interventions? And to no fault of anybody's, our process was not a good process. And it was because there was a systematic breakdown, right? So if we look at everything in a gear and a wheel, the system wasn't working properly. And it wasn't working properly because our process for intervention was not proper. So as we started to examine how we were going to do student interventions and early interventions and things of that sort, A2I now brought in formative assessments, right? It was truly a formative way of informing instruction. And that's typically where we lose the formative assessment piece, is that we offer the assessment, but we don't use the results to inform instruction. So A2I was forcing us to do that. The other thing that we started to look at is, are we providing the appropriate interventions? So if you have high-performing students in the classroom, were they too receiving the same interventions as the lower-performing students? And it was important for us that we were providing enrichment opportunities for the higher-performing students and making sure that we provide the more intense interventions for the lower. This all seems like, you know, common practice, right? Everybody's saying probably right now, well, that's an RTI model. Yeah, it just wasn't formalized. What A2I has done for us is it allowed us to build the RTI model into our instructional program by virtue of the assessment. So the assessment now was informing the instructional process and allowing us to provide the response to intervention. So as we did that, A2I is administered every 8 weeks in the Elmsford district. And at this point, we're now K through 3. And actually, arguably, we're pre-K through 3 because we actually have a foundational level as well. And we do have 2 pre-K classes. So we run an AM and a PM session. And it begins with the decoding and starting to familiarize students with words and things of that sort. So as we started to look at this in a systems approach and looking at RTI in a systems approach, we were now providing a whole different level of interventions. So these assessments were now giving us groupings. The student groupings were meaning focused and code focused. They were student centered or student focused and teacher centered. So those elements in those 4 quadrants, that's the way we have them established. You have 1 meaning focused student centered. You have 1 meaning focused teacher centered, 1 student focused code, and 1 teacher focused code. And what that allows us to do is now build in those interventions. So the students who needed more interventions were having more time on task with their teachers. And that was really now the ticket to what our pedagogical shifts became. And this paradigm shift happened where they started to value small group instruction. Again, it seems like a common sense approach, right? It's one of those things like, yeah, of course, small group instruction works. But how do we determine those small groups? How are they done? And again, this becomes a formative approach to determining who's in those small groups and what is the target focus for each of those groups. The other part of this is it offered the customized support, as I was saying, to the literacy coaches. And what we were able to do there is take the assessment data, unpack it, look at our pedagogical practices, plus delta charting, what worked, what didn't work. And then from there, being able to build on this kind of continuous improvement model where we were going to develop new interventions, right? We were going to shift the way we were doing things, standardize what worked, and hopefully continuously improve. And in that, one of the things that teachers did was they started to change their lesson planning. And truth be told, we ran into a little bit of a wrinkle here. As we were going through the lesson planning, it just wasn't syncing with the Journeys reading series that we were using at the time. It wasn't syncing well. And I got to tell you, this is where problem solving comes in. And this is where the art of articulation became so paramount for us. Because what we were able to do is determine that Journeys wasn't working for us, not because it wasn't working in A2I, it just wasn't working for us. It wasn't working for us in the area of interventions. So we started to look at what was a better level of intervention, and we kind of fell upon Fontes and Pinnell's LLI, the level literacy interventions. And we started to standardize that as a practice. And today in Elmsford, in pre-K through grade 6 now, we're using Fontes and Pinnell's LLI with a small group instructional model. So if there's one thing that I guess I keep haunting Learning Ovations about is please get this up to 6th grade. I want to see it in math, science, social studies, because standardizing this process for us has produced amazing results. So that's where we were on this journey. And the part 2 of the journey was March 13th of 2020, when all of a sudden we had announced that we were no longer coming to school for at least the next 2 weeks due to this pandemic. And our teachers had to make this immediate shift into a remote learning environment. And how was I going to do this? What would this look like? I've never taught remotely before. There was no prouder moment than this time and watching the teachers make that shift almost seamlessly. And honestly, A2I, I think, was really almost like a comforting factor in that shift, because the teachers knew what small group instruction looked like. We were just doing it through a Zoom feature now. right? We wound up shifting over to Google Meets, but that's another story for another day, because we are a Google district. And one of the things we started to do is learning the art of breakout rooms, right? So now that same environment that you had in the classroom, you now have with breakout rooms. And I should say, for full transparency, you got to invest in where you believe you need the most amount of assistance. And if you're truly committed to this work, the investment is well worth it. And what I mean by that is we invested in the human capital, right? We were looking at teaching assistants in every grade level, in pre-K through grade 1, and now up to grade 3, to make sure that they had those interventions in place. So if you're going into a breakout room, you also have a teaching assistant that's able to move the students along, right? Because as you can imagine, putting pre-K or kindergartners, as you know, in a breakout room is not the easiest thing, right? So we wanted to make sure that we had those levels of support there as well. So as we moved through the pandemic, the most interesting thing was we started to see that even as we were doing the small group instruction, students did not lose their skills. And in fact, they were actually growing in their skills. Regrettably, the only thing I will say, and I really, this is all hindsight, because when we went into the pandemic quarantine, I didn't realize how important the assessment piece was at that time. And we weren't thinking clearly about this. So as a result, we didn't offer those assessments from March till June. And in hindsight, I really wish I would have, because we would have had those tangible benchmarks for us to compare against and make sure that our students were still progressing. So when we came back in September, we returned with a hybrid model. We have about 70% of our students in 2 cohorts. The other 30% are in a full remote environment. And we shifted I want to say about 4 months ago, to a full synchronous model. In other words, even if you're remote, you're getting live instruction, and it's happening 5 days a week. Our students come in the in-person model 2 days a week, which we're utilizing for our interventions. On Wednesday, everybody is remote. And on Thursday, we have the second cohort that comes in, while the first cohort is now remote. So that has been a little bit of a challenge for us. We worked through that challenge. And again, using the breakout room feature, using Learning Ovations to create those 4 groupings is really important. And I just received, well, not just, but I received the fall outcomes report, and Elmsford is proudly ahead of the trend line. Like when we look at the research studies, we're ahead of that trend line. This is remarkable for us. You know, we were always one of those districts that was trying to play catch up and trying to get where our neighbors were, and making sure that we're providing the right reading strategies and things of that sort. And what we saw with the current outcomes, again, is nothing short of remarkable. And just kudos to the Learning Ovation staff. Thank you so much for your outreach, your support. And then really just a huge shout out to my staff here. The instructional staff, both at our primary school and elementary school, have embraced this. They are hard workers, dedicated to this cause, and the outcomes are showing it. So thank you for the opportunity, and I hope I provide you with a little bit of the insight.
Awesome. Just to build really quickly on where kind of Mark left off as far as the outcomes go, we did include a few of those snapshots to share with you guys as well. So as far as Elmsford's kind of journey through the A2I trajectory, our implementation process actually begins in K2. And so these are our students who we started with on our very first year at Elmsford. These students started blue in kindergarten, and these students in red were the first graders of that year. And you can see, just as Mark described, that when they entered this year in their either 3rd grade for the red or 2nd grade year, they are both almost 4 months ahead of where we'd expect on level to be. So at the beginning of 3rd grade, on level would be 3.0, and same 2nd grade would be 2.0. Both of them are almost 4 months ahead. And so we're really impressed with their progress as well. And we've actually had the honor of sharing, they have shared additional data with us. And so This is on the A2I assessment, but that progress was also documented on their iReady assessments. So you can see the shift from 2015 up through 2019. And there was a really quite a jump in 2019 when our implementation really took off. So we're really excited to be collaborating and partnering with them. And we're even more excited to see these outcomes really taking place, not just in our research settings, but in these real world schools in the midst of a pandemic, which was not expected for anyone.
Sarah, if I may, I also like to share with everyone a really, this is a bright spot, right? But we have one particular bright spot. We had a student in first grade. When we made the shift to LLI, the student started with us at the first cohort of A2I. And when that student went into first grade, we started to realize they were reading well above grade level. LLI allowed us the opportunity to offer higher reading levels. And because we had the tangibles with the A2I assessments, as well as what the student was doing in their group work and the formative assessment just from the classroom perspective, what we found was the student was actually reading in first grade at early third grade reading level. And we were able to provide that level of enrichment. And the student is just flying today. I mean, remarkable progress. And I don't think we would have gotten them to their maximum level, to the optimal level, without that insight.
Well, Mark and Sarah, we thank you so much here at PNW BOCES for sharing your research and your practice and dedicating this time to learn with us. We are open for any questions. Please unmute, share any questions in the chat. You have our contact information. Feel free to reach out. We are here to help. And Sarah and Mark, thank you so much. We truly appreciate your time.
Thank you.